Adult education. Sorry, Keith. You got it. Well, welcome to adult education here at Westminster. It is good to be together. We have some, but not too many seats up front. And there are extra chairs in the back, so help yourselves. It's good to be together today. Matt tells me that at the end of last class, when he announced to you guys that today we would be talking about kings, there was sort of an audible gasp, maybe an audible groan. Is that right? Yeah. You know, a year ago, this might have felt like a more academic topic, but I don't think we have to make too strong a case for the relevance of this topic today. So I'm excited to go through this topic with you. We're going to start, as we often do in here, with a little bit of a group activity, a full group activity. I'm going to ask you to think of examples of kings and kingship in the Bible. Think of an example of a king. Just keep it in your head for a minute. I will need a volunteer to write some names on the whiteboard, and I have a cheat sheet of spellings here, so if we get really obscure, we can help our volunteer out. So do we have a volunteer to write some names? Yes, we got Kathy. Thank you, Kathy. Excellent. Okay, so let's give some examples of kings in the Bible. Oh, and Kathy, you see there's a negative and a positive? So it's a sort of a goofus and gallant of kings, right? We're looking for, we're also going to advise Kathy about where on this spectrum we should put each of the kings. So do we have any examples? We don't need the mic, we can just shout them out. Yeah, Kathleen. The three kings, yeah, I like that. All right, the three kings, where would we put them? We'd put those on the plus side, yep. So the three kings, the three magi. Solomon, we have Solomon. Where are we going to put Solomon? Plus side, but maybe a little, not entirely, not maybe as far positive as yeah, it's a continuum. Yeah. What about David? I heard David. Left of Solomon, in the middle. Let's put David in the middle. We're going to spend a lot of time on David today as sort of an example of the complexity of these kingly figures. Great. Herod, where are we going to put Herod? He's probably on the minus side, yep. Nebuchadnezzar, wow. He is actually not on my list of kings because this is really outside the box thinking. Let's put him on the negative side. And Nebuchadnezzar. No, I don't know if that's right. I have no idea. Somebody look it up, and if you need to, just go up there and make a little correction. Yes. For his gardens. He did have some nice gardens, and in the book of Daniel, he kind of, we can do a little. But no, Nebuchadnezzar is a pretty bad guy in the biblical world. We're going to keep him where he is. Yeah, you can have nice gardens and be an evil king, it turns out. Yes. Yes. Other kings we can think of. What is that? Who is that king? Zimri. In the northern kingdom for 7 days. Wow. I don't even think he makes it on my list. Oh, he is. Zimri. Where would you put him? Very bad. Let's put him on the very bad side. Wow. That is an amazing, obscure reference. John, we're so glad we have you on the Adult Ed Council. Wow. Okay. Ahab. Yeah, where should we put Ahab? He's pretty far on the bad side, at least in the biblical view. Historians actually think he was one of the stronger kings of Israel, that he was one of the most successful kings in terms of military victories, in terms of expanding and administering the state, but the Bible kind of pans him as a king. Yeah, any others? Yes. Oh, king, yes. How do we pronounce his name? Ahasuerus, Artaxerxes. Yeah, where would you put him on the list? Do you have his spelling right there? Okay. Yes, Ahasuerus, Artaxerxes. We have him kind of in the middle. He's probably closer to the negative side, although he is portrayed as kind of a buffoon in the book. He is not portrayed as an evil mastermind necessarily, but in some ways his incompetence and negligence leads to some pretty negative consequences for the people. Anybody else? Any other? Caesar, yes. And now we're talking, some of our kings are actually kind of also emperors. So Nebuchadnezzar is kind of this way, Caesar is this way. And that's an interesting one to where do we place him in terms of how does the Bible think of Caesar? How far is the Bible willing to go in its critique of Caesar? Different gospels have different levels of kind of accommodation to the empire, for example. We can put him sort of more towards the negative side, but maybe not quite where Nebuchadnezzar is, yeah. Yeah, because there's a number, right? Caesar's a title, not a name. Yeah, that's probably the one we're thinking of for this time period. Yeah. Okay. All right. Interesting. So I'm going to reframe this. I'm going to reframe Paul's point a little bit. So there's a beautiful line from Marilyn Robinson's book. When I was a child, I read books, and it's about Christmas and incarnation and how kind of incredible it is that it's Jesus that we sing songs about still today. She says, Caesar Augustus was also thought to be a god, and yet no one is singing songs about him. And so you're sort of anticipating actually where we're leading to, what does it mean as Christians to proclaim Christ as king? But before we get there, we're going to talk about a lot of other things in kingship, but thank you for sort of anticipating this. So any other kings? We'll take maybe one more if anybody can think of one. King Cyrus, yes. So Cyrus, empire of the Persians, where would we put Cyrus on here? Sort of more towards the positive side. Yeah, maybe not quite as great as the Magi, but we'll put him on the positive side. And we're putting him there because he's the emperor of Persia, and he is responsible for the decree that allows the people to return to Persia after exile. Thank you so much to the volunteers in the back who are getting out extra chairs for us. If we need to, we can go to Westminster Hall for yet another stack. In the closet is where they are, and thank you. I will ask for more tables next time. Clearly, everybody wants to talk about kings. So we're gonna put ourselves back in the ancient context for a minute here, because kingship is kind of the default of political organization in the ancient world. There are some exceptions, there are some examples of democracies and republics, but by and large, especially when we're talking about the time of the Hebrew Bible and the sort of worldview of the neighbors of ancient Israel, king is the default. We're not thinking of the Bible as responding to a particular moment in which people are used to a democratic republic, right, which is the moment that we're in 21st century America. We're used to a people surrounded by other polities that are governed primarily by kings. And the role of the king, there's military and civil and political and economic functions. So the king's primary job is to wage war. And if the king is winning wars, then there's probably going to be support for the king. Military victories are key to sort of establishing the authority of the king and maintaining that authority. The king is also going to be responsible for administering a state, and we'll see Israel goes through varying degrees of being an administrative state. We are living in a very complex modern bureaucracy. In the ancient world, there were different degrees of bureaucratic administration in different times and places, but in many cases, part of the king's role was administration. Constructing fortifications, defending towns, this is part of that sort of military and defensive role of the king. Organizing irrigation and agriculture, part of what enabled these complex civilizations to emerge was a highly organized agricultural structure, and often the king was involved in setting up and maintaining this kind of an economic system. Levying taxes that would pay for things like fortifications and defense, conscripting people for the army and also for public works. It wasn't just military service, but it could be building projects that people would get pressed into service for. Upholding justice and peace. And also in many cultures beyond Israel, the king was also seen as the protector of the weak and the vulnerable. It helped to have sort of one person at the top in charge rather than competing oligarchs battling against each other. There's a king in charge, and the king was also thought to be the sort of final arbiter for the poor and the vulnerable. And then, so this is the backdrop of kingship. Different kings in different places succeeded and failed in various degrees, but this is sort of what the cultures of the time thought of as the role of a king. And so in Israel, we have some similarities and some differences in terms of how kingship emerges. The first thing that's different is that in Israel, unlike other ancient civilizations, we have memories of a time before the king. Our written texts that are preserved tell kind of an origin story of kingship and tell the stories of pre-kingly political leaders. And that's kind of important for thinking about how are kings viewed in the Bible, because a time before kings is part of the cultural memory of ancient Israel. Because Israel originated as a number of small, non-urban settlements in the hill country. A lot harder to administer, right, than a place with fertile plains and a central capital. Sort of geographically, Israel presented a problem for kingship, for unification, for leadership, because it's a very hilly terrain with different settlements, different tribes in different regions. And there was, in fact, no real central city until David captured Jerusalem. That was sort of part of enabling the foundations of kingship, was this sort of military action of capturing Jerusalem, and then that becomes the capital city under Solomon. The temple will be built there. There was a sense of the king was appointed by God. We'll see that in the way that King Saul gets elected, but then is also confirmed by the people. And there are some cases where the people remove or reject a king for levying too high taxes or sort of failing to fulfill promises. We'll see that later on. So there is a sense that the people have a voice in this. It is not a democracy. We're not thinking of everybody registering to vote in ancient Israel and casting a vote, but there is a sense of the king having an accountability to the promises that the king makes to the people. And then finally, and we're going to see this as a point of contention, but that the king is accountable to Torah, that there is a law, and the king is not above that law, which is true of all of the people in ancient Israel, right? So there's a sense that the king is not the final source of his own authority, is part of how this is understood. And in fact, there are other authorities as well. There are prophets and priests and the law, and we'll see how those play in various points in the history of ancient Israel to limit or check the power of the king. So all of this is based on this idea that the king is not the be-all and end-all, that in fact it is God who is the ultimate authority, and that God's authority is made manifest through different media or people, the prophets, the priests, the law. It's not, the king himself in other cultures was sometimes thought to be a god or to have the most direct access to God, and that's not the case in the Israelite understanding of kingship. So you see I've got some Bibles on your tables, and if you're in the back, there's a Bible cart, should be somewhere in the back. We can pass out the rest of the Bibles to those folks there. And I'm gonna have you read some passages now so we can talk a little bit about this. If you are in this, if you are on that side of the room, so if you're on the side of the room here with the double doors, you guys are going to be reading 1 Samuel 8, verses 4 through 9. This middle row of tables here, you guys are going to be reading 1 Samuel 8, verses 10 through 18. And over here on this side of the room, you guys are going to go to Deuteronomy, and you'll read Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20. And if you're with us online, if you could please also read that passage from Deuteronomy. And you're welcome to comment in the chat. We've got Joy monitoring the chat for us today, so you're welcome to pipe in too. I'm just curious, what view of kingship do you see in your passage, and what are some of the limits there? If you're having a difficulty finding your book in the Bible, always feel free to look up front at the table of contents. That's a great first way to start. So 1 Samuel and Deuteronomy. I'll give you guys a couple of minutes together to look this through. And again, what view of kingship is portrayed in this passage?
expectations.
Readable. Build a ballroom. You can just insert that right in there.
A big, beautiful.
Yeah.
Did it say no ballroom too there?
Big, beautiful you can have.
Yeah, it just said no ballroom. I think that's like the horses. Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
the
it's-
equivalent.
Yeah, reading a book and thinking, oh, a concert. I don't know if I invite you.
Oh, well, hold on. But you know, it's interesting because it says, you shall, elect among you a king, and he shall not be a foreigner. So that, is kind of the basis for how we are. You elect somebody and not be a foreigner. He should care for his people and not be for self-gratification. So it's kind of a basic premise that we would like to apply to now.
Netanyahu doesn't meet this standard either.
Oh, he hasn't read this part.
Probably not. Probably. This is his law.
I don't think he's religious, though.
Isn't there somewhere where the Israelites...
Okay, I'm hearing a lot of good conversation around your tables. I'm gonna call us back together, and I think Tim, do we have you running our mic today? Thank you so much. If we could start on this side of the room here, what is going on in the passage that you guys were assigned for today? What's happening here? Who's having a conversation? What's it about?
Somebody. So quiet. Here.
Yes,
John,
we
you
got somebody. Oh, sorry.
Here you go, John.
All right.
The elders of Israel are less than satisfied with Samuel's sons taking over for his role, so they ask for a king. And Samuel goes to God, and God says, listen to them. I brought them out of Egypt, but they keep rejecting me. If they want a king, go ahead and give them a king.
Yeah, thank you, John. No, that's great. So this is our setup of this is the story of how Israel first gets a king, which is the people are demanding or asking for a king, that the leadership of Samuel's sons is less than satisfactory, and they say, other nations have a king, we want one too, right? Like that other kid has an Xbox, so I want one. It's a sort of a similar thing, right? But this is a moment of considerable danger for the people. The Philistines are the sort of enemy on the scene here, and there's a sense of they need a king for military leadership together. So they ask Samuel, who is a prophet and kind of a judge. Do we remember the judges in the Bible? This is before we get to Kings, right? The books before 1st and 2nd Samuel and Ruth are Joshua and Judges. So pre-kingship, leadership in Israel takes the form of these judges who are these figures who are called to rule for a specific time, for sort of a specific purpose. Their leadership is military, it's political, it's judicial, but they're called judges, but they serve a variety of roles. Our judges today are not military leaders. These judges were. But it was more ad hoc leadership when a certain circumstance arose. And the people here are saying, we want something more stable, we want a dynastic kingship. And God, in saying this, God says, okay, there's a real sense of God respecting the people's freedom here to choose their own polity. But John, you raise this concern that God has because God has been in this role of king, right? God has been the one delivering the people in their military victories. God has been the one providing for the people. And so in some ways, from the beginning, kingship is portrayed as a rejection of God as sovereign over the people. So what then do we learn in this next part of 1 Samuel 7? Somebody from the middle rows here. What do we learn about what kingship will look like? Yeah, Betty.
So Samuel reports what God says. Here's all the things that your king is going to take. He's going to take your women, and he's going to take your he's going to tax you. He's going to take your sons and make them do this. He's going to take everything.
Yeah.
And at the end it says, that the Lord is not going to answer you once you're mad at your king.
Yeah, you're on your own here.
You're on your own here.
Yeah.
You did it to yourself,
Yeah,
essentially.
yeah. And that'll be interesting is what will God's role be with the people as kingship unfolds. But we see this sort of naming of the dangers of vesting too much authority in one person, that sort of with this military strength, with this political organization, the cost will also be this kind of rapacious taking of money, of people, of power. And so that warning is delivered sort of right at the beginning. And then what do we get over here in the passage that we read from Deuteronomy? So shifting from this scene, this narrative scene in 1 Samuel where kingship is established, to this portion of the Torah, of the law, that is a sort of legal description of the king and the king's role. What do we see for those who read Deuteronomy either in person or online?
It clearly lays out what he can't do. Can't take hoard horses, hoard women, hoard money. I'm trying to look through here not to miss anything. May not acquire many wives. When you've taken the throne, you have a copy of this law.
Right.
Remains with him and lays it out so that he and his descendants reign long over the land.
Yes.
Other people.
Yeah, so there's a call to restraint here in Deuteronomy, the sort of specific not taking, and also this is a place where that the king is not above the law gets really emphasized, is in the book of Deuteronomy. So it might be tempting to think, well, here's what happened. The people had this law, Deuteronomy, that was given, that already anticipated a king, and then they chose a king, and there were some warnings about the king that were given at that time, and then afterwards the kings came along and were not the greatest, right? That the sort of the warnings of 1 Samuel came true, the prescriptions of Deuteronomy were not followed. The tricky thing is that the books of the Bible were not necessarily written contemporaneously with the periods that they're describing. So this is one of the things that Matt and I have been sort of trying to emphasize, but it can be sort of hard to get our heads around, which is that this is not a report necessarily written at the moment. We think that Deuteronomy came from actually a later time, writing back into this time. And in the same way, the narrative account of 1 Samuel represents a similar perspective or point of view that actually comes from a later point in time. So we can all remember this scary, terrible slide from our Older Testament class. A lot of what comes to us in Deuteronomy comes from a time after the kingdom has already been divided and after the northern kingdom of Israel has fallen to the Assyrians. And so there are some ways in which these passages that we've read form a political and theological perspective that's trying to account for why did the northern kingdom fall, and later why did the southern kingdom also fall. So a lot of these critiques of kingship, these limits on kingship, are sort of written in after the fact. As we're looking at what's the Bible's take on kingship, we need to remember that, like many of our sources today, the biblical sources have a perspective, have a point of view, are making an argument even when they're telling the story. And that's the case in how the Bible understands kings. We'll see that especially when we get to David, how complex David is as a figure has something to do with the ways in which his stories are told and the interests behind the stories that are being told about David as a king. So let's begin by looking at the sort of first three kings that we have over here, Saul, David, and Solomon. And if, one of the interesting things about the sort of historical memory is, Israel is sort of presented in the Bible as this sort of unified people that then in historical tragedy falls apart. And really, there's unity under three kings, Saul, David, Solomon, that's it. The period of a united kingship is pretty short. And that has to do in some ways with what we talked about earlier, with Israel being a series of small tribal groupings in hilly terrain. This is a hard group to kind of get together and unify politically, and pretty soon it falls apart. But it begins, our story tells us, with Saul, who is of the tribe of Benjamin, and he is handsome and tall. Saul is the sort of guy that you would sort of look at and be like, yeah, let's have him be the king. He's the big, tall guy. He's a successful military leader. He's succeeding in battle against the Philistines, and if we remember, that's part of the impetus for the choice of a king, we're told by Scripture at the beginning. And then he's anointed by the prophet Samuel 3 times, once in private, once he's chosen by lot, by the people, and then again after his military victory. So there's these sort of 3 anointings of Saul that we get. But Saul is kind of a COVID king. He's kind of a work from home king. He doesn't build a palace. He doesn't try to centralize power. People bring him disputes and he kind of hears them. He sets up a table in his garden. So this is a king with a garden, but in a very kind of humble sense. And there's a sense that Saul doesn't quite get it. Saul doesn't have quite the thirst for power that comes later. Saul really is kind of stepping up and filling in here. He gets a kind of bad rap because he gets pretty jealous when David comes on the scene and really starts usurping power here. But Saul is one of those figures in the Bible that you think probably like you were actually like a fairly good dude, and then the thing got, the story got retold in a way that made it natural that you would be this fallen king. So the way that the story accounts for it is that he failed to carry out God's command to utterly destroy the Amalekites. This was one of the peoples that the Israelites were fighting. And the command was supposedly to put them to the ban, to destroy all of the people and the animals. And Saul spared the king and spared the animals, and this was not enough. So this is how the story, which has a real incentive for assigning concrete reasons for disaster, for giving an account for disaster in somebody's unfaithfulness, this is what it assigns to Saul as sort of the reason that he no longer remains king. So instead, we get this other figure rising up who is not a son of Saul. Saul has sons; they could take over. If kingship is going to be hereditary, it would make sense for one of Saul's sons to succeed him. But no, instead we have this figure, David, who is chosen by Samuel from among the sons of Jesse in Bethlehem. So David comes from a different tribe, the tribe of Judah. And he becomes sort of the lyre player and armor bearer for Saul. There's 2 accounts of how he ends up in Saul's court, serving King Saul. And he defeats Goliath and has other military victories early on. He is a small guy, slight of stature, but he is really good on the battlefield. And David pretty early on shows promise in Saul's court. And he is loved by the people, including some of Saul's children love David. There's the story of this intimate friendship between David and Jonathan, and then Michal is one of the daughters of Saul. And so there's a sense that David is favored by the people and by God from an early age. And I like this portrayal of them because that's Saul and David kind of looking at each other. And there's this love. Saul loves David, but there's also the seeds of some of the tension that will happen. So we've got these 2 origin stories of David. One where he's chosen by the prophet Samuel after all of the big, strong, strapping brothers of David are portrayed before him, the sons of Jesse. And Samuel says, no, none of them is quite right. And then it's the little guy who's out there tending the sheep, David, who gets chosen. The other origin story is that David goes to help those brothers when they're fighting the Philistines to bring them to food and armor, and then David volunteers as the hero to go up against Goliath. So the story supplies us with these 2 origin myths of David and how he sort of got near the throne. And there's this need to portray David as having got there by chance, by God's favor, certainly not by his own designs. But then when you read the stories, there's also this sense that David is scheming all the time. And sort of holding these 2 things together, right? This like naked political ambition and this sense of sort of divine favoredness. It's a fascinating narrative. In preparation for this class, I went back and I watched our interviews with Joel Baden from 2 years ago for our Older Testament series. I would recommend them because this is some of the most interesting stories, narrative stories and stories of political intrigue that we have in the Bible. So we got some scandals involving David too. These we don't remember as well. Sunday school David is sort of lifted up as this model, but the David in the stories, I remember a sense of real disappointment when we went over this 2 years ago. I think, Claire, I remember like, what is this guy doing in the Bible, right? So his people are a group of bandits, of outcasts, of misfits that sort of gather in this remote cave, and he sort of pulls them together in this sort of private army that he has. So David has this group of this sort of paramilitary collection of guys going around, and they do some things that are not that feel. Well, there's one that feels like a protection racket, right? Where they go up to this guy Nabal, who's a rich guy with a lot of sheep. He's got this like beautiful, really smart wife, Abigail, and they go up to him. David sends 10 of his young men up to this guy and says, like, I see nothing's happened to your sheep. Wouldn't it be nice if it stayed that way? Essentially, right? And so Nabal dismisses these guys and says, I don't need you. And then, we assume that what would unfold next is that then they would go and attack the sheep, and then this would be sort of required protection. But instead, Abigail intervenes, convinces David not to attack, to show mercy, to not get involved in this this story of retribution. And so David says, "Okay, I won't attack Nabal." Abigail goes home, tells the good news to her husband. He's partying, he's celebrating. His heart, it says his heart stops, and then 10 days later he dies. I don't quite know how that works medically, but it just happens that he dies, right? It's very convenient for David because David's going to take over all the sheep and also marry Abigail. So David gets a really good deal out of this, but David's hands are clean. So there's a way in which the story of David is seeking to account for all of these convenient things that seem to happen to him while not causing him blame. He seems like this kind of Teflon guy who you can pin nothing on King David, is sort of how this story seems to work. At a certain point, David starts fighting for the enemy. He becomes a vassal for the Philistines, and the narrative is very clear to point out that by means of trickery, he never has to attack an Israelite settlement, but he's working for the enemy in sort of a mercenary way for a time. Then there's the story of Uriah and Bathsheba. This is another case of David finding his way into bed with somebody who's married to somebody else. This is the story of David tricking Uriah, sending him, David has an affair with Bathsheba. That's not the way to put it. It feels pretty coercive, what David does with Bathsheba. I don't think we can assign her agency in this. And then tries to call Uriah home as cover in case a child is born of this union. Uriah comes home, refuses to go to bed with his wife because there are men out there in the fields, and he says, who am I to eat and drink and enjoy myself while the soldiers are out there in battle? Then the question is, who is David to be doing that, right? And so the paternity of the child will be in question. And so David sends Uriah into the front lines of battle, abandons him there, he dies. This is the story of the birth of Solomon. The child born of this particular union is not Solomon. That child is said to die, and then a later child of David and Bathsheba is said to be Solomon. But we have Solomon's origin story caught up in this scandal of David as well. And it's thought that in this case, this story does look so bad for David that it's thought that probably that story was contributed by Team Solomon, right? This is a story that tries to establish some legitimacy for Solomon on the throne. And so, and then later on in David's kingship, there's further scandal, there's heartache, there's a story of David's son Absalom who rebels, and this is a story both of political intrigue but also family heartbreak as Absalom dies, and David is mourning for him even though he was a son who rebelled. So there's a lot about King David that is difficult and scandalous here. And at the same time, right, there's David sitting between wisdom and prophecy. There's this elevation of David as a figure. So there's another perspective on David as a king that's embedded in the Bible. In 2 Samuel verse 7, there's this Davidic covenant that's established, which sets up a permanent dynasty where a Davidic king will be on the throne, and the Davidic king is metaphorically son of God, not in the sense of incarnation as we think of Jesus later on, but that David's offspring will be favored by God and remain on the throne of Judah. And this does become a source of messianic expectation later on when Israel loses autonomy and no longer has a king. The sense of the return of a Davidic figure as a savior figure gets built in. This will later get attached to Jesus and his arrival. Having that Davidic lineage will be important for Jesus, who is also then born in Bethlehem. And is this covenant conditional or not? So 1st and 2nd Kings will rework this Davidic covenant, which seems like just a promise that there will be a Davidic king on the throne. It then becomes more of a conditional promise. So David is said to say to his son Solomon on his deathbed, walk in obedience to God, keep his decrees and commandments, his laws and regulations. Do this so that you may prosper in all that you do. And there's a little bit of an if-then that gets attached to this covenant. And in some ways, the breach of that faithfulness to God, we talked about this earlier when we read that section from Deuteronomy, the sort of breach of faithfulness of God is used to account for why the Davidic kings ultimately fell. And so David says this in 1st and 2nd Kings, and in the very next breath, he gives Solomon, his son, kind of a hit list. You know, he says, these are the commanders who will probably betray you. I wouldn't let them go down to the grave with gray hairs, is sort of how he puts it, right? So there's this really complex portrayal of David in our scriptures. It's hard to say the Bible entirely disfavors kings, but it's also hard to say that the Bible gives us a model, even its most iconic king, as somebody who is a model of moral leadership. And the portrayal of David really is, there's a real sense of political realism in how he shows up as a figure and how he uses power. This is, let's see. Yeah, so I think I've talked about already the kind of multiple layers of the Davidic portrayal here. Let's go on to look at Solomon. Solomon is known for his administrative abilities, for his economic leadership. He centralized administrative districts in Israel, so making it less dependent on tribal leadership of particular pockets and more accountable to a centralized administration. He expanded trade routes. Solomon oversaw sort of one of the most prosperous times for Israel. We're told he had 700 wives, also some concubines. I don't know what happened to the Deuteronomy prohibition. Don't have too many wives. I think this might count as too many wives. But of course, right, this Deuteronomistic, this part of the Bible hasn't yet been written at the time of Solomon. So it's a later projection back to think, where did we go wrong here? Part of this is also that some of Solomon's wives were from other places. They brought in the worship of other gods. There was a thought that this sort of diluted and distracted from the worship of Yahweh. Although in terms of worship, Solomon did build the temple, right? David doesn't get to build the temple, Solomon does. So, and then he also built himself a palace that was much bigger and took much longer than the temple. So again, with Solomon, we have this complex figure. He is known for his wisdom. I think I forgot to say David, known for his poetry. The Psalms are ascribed to David. Sometimes Ecclesiastes is ascribed to King Solomon, or Proverbs are ascribed to not Ecclesiastes, Proverbs are ascribed to King Solomon as this wise figure. So again, a complex kind of portrayal. But things don't last too long after that, because after Solomon, we have a division in the kingdom that is to remain. One of Solomon's sons, Rehoboam, succeeds him, but then Jeroboam pulls the northern tribes away. And so, and this is also assigned in some ways to some of Rehoboam's failures as a leader, because the people say, please discontinue the oppressive taxes of your father Solomon. We are struggling here. And Rehoboam asks the elders what he should do. They say, listen to the people. And then he asks the young men what he should do. And they say, do whatever you want to, you're king. So he continues with the oppressive taxes. And then the northern kingdoms rebel against him. This is the point at which we have division. And then this is what comes after. These are the kings of Israel and Judah. We have little frowny faces and smiley faces. I'm sure we could ask John to recite this list from memory, apparently, because we do see that Zimri is on there, all 7 days of his reign, I guess. And as you can see, whoever put this list together has assigned little smiley faces and little frowny faces. Some of these kings are considered by the Deuteronomistic history to be good kings. Others are considered bad kings. It looks like pretty much all the kings of Israel are considered to be bad kings. Again, this is a story with a point of view. This is a point of view from the southern kingdom after the northern one has failed. And none of those kings is a genetic successor of David. And so there's a sense that story's already been determined, that they are all evil kings. And as I said, some of them are actually were probably pretty strong leaders who did some good things for the country. Ahab, for example, was thought to have presided over one of the most militarily and economically sort of stable periods of the northern kingdom. But they are just sort of remembered as sort of universally vile, and that has to do with them having the way that the narrative accounts for it is more theological than it is political. They are named as having gone against the will of God, gone after other gods, created sites of worship outside of the temple in Jerusalem, so sites in Bethel or in Dan or places in the northern kingdom that became sites of worship. And even on the Judah side, it's sort of a mostly bad news story, some good kings in there. One of the good kings that I do want to talk about is King Josiah. He is one of the last of the kings. He's reigning in the 7th century, one of the last of the kings of the southern kingdom, Judah. And what he's known for is his reforms. So Josiah he takes the throne at age 8, reigns for 31 years. And this is a period when the Assyrian Empire, which destroyed the northern kingdom, is in decline. So it's a period of relative peace and stability for the southern kingdom that's going to end with the next generation, with the rise of Babylon. So all of this, the Deuteronomistic history is trying to tell us that this has to do with things that were internal to the people, specifically how faithful they were to God, how they followed the law, how they treated the poor and the stranger and the powerless. And that's true, and also there's something happening on the international scene that's making it much harder for Israel to remain autonomous, which has to do with the rise of this other empire, Babylon. But Josiah in this moment has he institutes a lot of reforms. A lot of them have to do with religious reforms. He removes foreign worship. He centralizes religious practices in Jerusalem. He celebrates the Passover, this sort of reminder of God's story of salvation, this reminder of God's leadership here. And so there's a sort of moment of reform. And at a certain point during a restoration of the temple, a book is discovered, and it's pulled out, and it's another book of law. We think that book is probably Deuteronomy, so dating from this period, but given a story going back earlier. And this is the period when we get this idea of the king should not be above the law. The king should be listening to and following the Torah. So law is one source of check on divine power. Another source are, of course, prophets. This we have David here being rebuked by the prophet Nathan. This is after the Uriah and Bathsheba incident. And Nathan does this in this brilliant way. He tells David this story of this rich man who is having dinner for his friends, doesn't want to slaughter one of his own animals, so he goes and he gets the poor little ewe lamb of a rich man. This is his only animal, and this animal is more of a pet than livestock. But the rich man takes the poor man's lamb, kills it, they have it for dinner. And David gets so mad at this story, at the injustice of this story. And Nathan points to him and says, "You are that man, right? You just did this to another person's wife. This is you, Bathsheba, and Uriah." And David realizes. So the prophet here can be sort of the moral conscience of the king. That's how David shows up in the story. Here in the story of the prophet Elijah, we just have the prophet in this power struggle against the king. This is Elijah, and the king at the time is Ahab. This is less of a sort of relational story of the prophet as conscience of the king. This is more of a story where Elijah demonstrates the power of God as opposed to the power of the false prophets of Baal. I'm going to move through this a little bit quickly because I want you to get to some discussion time here at the end. This is I think I preached on this story a couple of weeks ago. This is King Jehoiakim burning the scroll of the prophet Jeremiah. So this is a king rejecting the words of a prophet who has deposed him. Jehoiakim is one of the sons of Josiah. So this period of reform under Josiah does not last long. And we get these, right as Babylon is rising, this quick succession of brothers, these are Josiah's sons, one of whom is Jehoiakim, and this fervor of opposition between prophets and kings in this period. So, yes, Dan. Yeah, this is a good question. Some of them do get attested in records aside from the Bible. So the Assyrian records, for example, name some of the kings of Israel. I think Rehoboam might be the first one named in the Assyrian records, but I might have that wrong. I'm not strong on my biblical archaeology, but some of them are, in fact, attested externally. There are some scholars who want to say that David is a fiction. Most scholars don't believe that, but a lot of by this point, we're on safer territory than we were back when we were talking about, say, Moses, of, do we have inscriptions that name the king? And part of this is that these big empires that they're up against are keeping records of who are they raiding, who are they seizing, which kings are they deposing. So we're getting into more verifiable historical territory here. Yeah. Okay, I want to give you guys some opportunity to come to the present moment and sort of talk about what does this, it's hard to say the Bible's take on kingship, because I hope that I've established here that the Bible has multiple takes on kingship. There seem to be some really strong endorsements. There seem to be some really strong critiques. But I want us to think at our tables about how this fits at the present moment. I'm going to give you time to discuss this. We're not going to get to the place that I wanted to get to, which is what is the vision that's offered in the Newer Testament of what is Christ as king? Who is Christ as king? What does the kingdom of God look like? How does that offer a sort of different perspective? So I'm sorry to say that we won't have time for all of that. Matt also has some things from his last time that he wants to carry over. But I really do want to get you the opportunity to start drawing some connections. So this, as I said, we didn't think that this was going to be such a politically relevant topic until a couple weeks ago, when it was like, yes, this is a theme that's very active in the discourse. And so I want you to talk amongst yourselves at the tables about what does the Bible suggest to us about the effects of power, and then what perspectives does the Bible offer that resonate with our current political moment. Okay, I'm going to give you time to talk about this. I'm going to need to get going to the next. To 10:30 worship is the next thing. But I want you guys to have some time around your table. So thank you very much.